Okay, so welcome to the Lincolnshire Aviation Heritage Centre. I'm Andrew Pant and I'm going to do this talk for you today. This is a little bit about the background to the centre and the Lancaster, how it ended up here, and the way forward to restoring her to airworthy condition. So thank you very much for joining us and paying an interest in what we're doing here. I've got a slideshow presentation as well as a few little videos in it for you as well, and I'll explain a little bit around the restoration work that we're doing. Okay, so where the story began. Top left there is Pilot Officer Christopher Panton. Christopher Panton flew on 433 Squadron on Halifaxes during the Second World War. Unfortunately, Chris was lost on the Nuremberg raid on the 31st of March 1943. Sorry, 44. He was a flight engineer, as I said, on Halifaxes, and he was one of 8 in his family. So the children in the family, there's 8 of them. He was one of the eldest, and he had 2 younger brothers, Fred and Harold Panton, who you can see on the bottom right of the image. So we've got Fred here, and Harold there, and me in the middle. So with the loss of Christopher, it obviously hit his family particularly hard. They actually lost 8 that night on that operation, on that crew, because they were carrying a Dicky pilot. So it's an 8th crew member getting an idea of operations before he led his crew on operations, probably the following night even. So on the crew here, we've got Christopher down at the bottom left. We've got Nielsen, who was the pilot. There's Millward, who was the bomb aimer. Cooper, who was the wireless operator. Allray, who was the navigator. And we have McLaughlin, who was the tail gunner. So Chris was English, British. Usually on a Canadian crew, on a Canadian squadron, they always had an English flight engineer, or a British flight engineer. Nielsen, the pilot, was Canadian, but he was originally from Danish descent. And then the back row, all Canadians. They eventually did receive an Irish bid-upper gunner, which was the gunner that was actually lost on the operation when the aircraft went down. We believe the person taking the photograph was actually an American who was the mid-upper gunner at that time, and he was Master Sergeant Wells. We don't actually know why Wells left the crew and Thompson joined, but we suspect it was probably because they reached their 25th operation. Wells went back to America and lived the war out in America, and he was replaced by an Irish mid-upper gunner. So with the loss of Christopher, it obviously hit the family particularly hard. It hit Fred and Harold's parents very hard, and Fred's father wanted nothing more to know about the war, didn't want to visit the grave, didn't want to see anything about the Second World War, obviously wanted it finished. They originally thought that losing Chris would actually affect his mother more than his father, but it actually turned the tables and the other way around. The telegram was actually delivered by one of Fred's friends from school. He was the postboy. And when Fred saw the postboy coming up the drive with a white envelope in his hand, he knew that the worst had happened. Fred was only 13 at the time, and Harold was 11. And Harold will tell the story that there was a row of trees down an avenue, and he used to think to himself, while Christopher was missing, if I can run to the next tree within a certain amount of time, so 10 seconds, say, then it'll all be false, and Chris will still be alive. And needless to say, they did receive that telegram to say that it was confirmed that he was killed in action. Christopher is buried at the Dernbach War Cemetery in Germany, along with other members of his crew. There are only, I believe it's 3 that survived the crash of the aircraft, the destruction of the aircraft. It was actually shot down by a night fighter using Schweigemusik. So if ever you've heard of the upward firing cannon on night fighters, unfortunately it took Chris's aircraft. So with the effect it had on the family, Fred and Harold were still interested in the Second World War. They wanted to find out more, they wanted to know more. But as I said, their father wanted nothing more to know of it. Fred and Harold, kept a keen interest, and Fred wanted to actually go over, find the crash site and visit Chris's grave. He asked his father on numerous occasions whether he could actually go over and have a look, but his father wouldn't allow it, he wouldn't let him go. Until one day, Fred's father said to him, Fred, I want you to get over to Germany and get a photo of Chris's grave for me. Of course, Fred was more than happy to do that, more than happy to go over and have a look and investigate the crash. So Fred went over in 1971. He went over in his Renault 4L with a friend, and they toured Germany. They parked on the middle of a roundabout in thick fog and camped without realizing it was the middle of a roundabout. They got onto various things while they were doing it and going around and trying to find the crash site. They actually managed to find the crash site. They spoke to the burgomaster, which is kind of the mayor of the village, the town. They were taken up to the crash site, and at that point you could still scrape the surface on the top and pick up pieces of aluminium and parts of the aircraft where it had crashed and blown up. One of the items that was actually found by a local researcher was Christopher's small miniature adjustable spanner, which we now have back here, and Fred, until his death, kept it at his house as well. So we know that that was in Chris's toolbox on board the aircraft, and he obviously used it many times, I would suspect. So Fred had a very good journey over to Germany. He went and he found the grave, he took photos of the grave, he found the crash site, he found out details about the aircraft being shot down, and went and saw the target and where the crew that survived the operation, because they bailed out, where they actually were kept as prisoners in the town before they were moved to the prisoner of war camp. They went to Stalag Luft 3, which is the prisoner of war camp that they actually lived the war out in. So Fred, very successful trip to Germany, and he came back and presented his father with some framed photographs of Christopher and his headstone in the cemetery. And shortly after that, Fred's father passed away. Now, when Fred got back from Germany, he had a lady called Madge who worked for him at the time. They were in a very small way into poultry, so they had about 10 or 12 chickens, I think it was, and the business was growing all the time. And Madge worked there doing some of the poultry work with them. And when Fred came back, Madge said to her, "I've got just the thing for you, Fred." And she handed him a newspaper cutting. And that newspaper cutting said, "Lancaster bomber for sale at Squires Gate." And Fred said, "You know, you couldn't have handed that to me at a better time, because this trip over to Germany had completely reignited his interest in Bomber Command. And he thought to himself, there's got to be some way that we can raise a memorial to Christopher, his crew, and the men who went missing from Bomber Command during the Second World War." So what you see here is Avro Lancaster NX611, at that point named Guy Gibson. And it was coming up for sale at an auction at Squires Gate in 1972. And we believe that Fred is just here. Now, anybody who knew Fred, that is just the way he stood. And he's wearing a flat cap, so it's got to be him. So the auction went on. Fred went to it, went to have a look at the aircraft. They actually ran up one of the engines just before the auction to demonstrate the aircraft. But sadly, the Lancaster never actually reached its auction reserve, so it wasn't sold during the auction. Which is quite fortunate, I guess, that Fred didn't buy it at the time, because had he bought it, he would have moved it to his farm at Stickford, and it would have sat out on his farm. So they do say things happen for a reason. The person who actually bought the aircraft bought it after the auction in a private sale. He contacted the seller, and a gentleman called the Right Honourable Lord Lilford bought the aircraft. He left it at Blackpool for a period. He had to rent the area of land that it stood on. So he left it there for a period. He originally thought he was going to take it over to Jersey and do pleasure flights and tours around Jersey, but that never came to fruition. I guess it came that the aircraft was going to be too expensive to restore and get over there, and he decided he would just leave it where it was at Blackpool. It was originally taken to Blackpool by Reflectair, which was the company that owned it at the time, and they had set up, or were setting up, an aviation museum over at Blackpool Airport. The aircraft itself has got a bit of a checkered history. It was originally built in April 1945 for Tiger Force, so it's going to go out to Japan and finish the war out over there. Obviously, before it actually got that far, the Americans saw to it and dropped the atomic bombs, and it never actually did operations over Japan and the Far East. So it was retired in the UK, in storage at Llandudno, I think it was, until after the war, the French L'Air Naval, the French Naval Air Force, decided they wanted Lancasters to add to their fleet for maritime reconnaissance. So this was one of, I think it was about 30 to 50 Lancasters that were taken over for L'Air Naval. She was painted white. Well, first of all, she was painted midnight blue, which is kind of a very dark American naval blue. And she was taken out and did a lot of maritime work. It's said that she did bombing in Indochina, which is now Vietnam, because the French were losing their colonies out there. It did all of its work really out off the coast of Australia, at New May as well, which is a little island out there. until it was actually retired by the French because they couldn't really afford to keep running them anymore, and it was replaced by a slightly larger American aircraft that took over the maritime work. So the French had these aircraft, retired them, didn't know what to do with them, had nothing really for them to do. So there was a group in the UK called HAPS, Historic Aircraft Preservation Society, that decided they would like to get a Lancaster and restore her and keep her running on the British circuit for air shows and displays. So they wrote a letter to the French, not really expecting they were going to get one, but the French said, yep, we've got one here, you can have it, and said, yep, we'll have it. They didn't know at the time that it was over in Australia, or just off Australia. So they had to raise the funds to bring her back from Australia, so bring her back from the island she was on to Australia, and then from Australia back to the UK. She landed at Biggin Hill in the mid-1960s. So here we are in 1972, the aircraft at Blackpool. As I say, it didn't sell in the sale, it was actually bought by Lord Lilford. Now Fred and Harold kept in close contact with Lord Lilford, because obviously they'd lost the chance to buy the aircraft, and they spoke to Lord Lilford quite regularly, and Lord Lilford said that he would give them the first opportunity of the aircraft if he were to sell it. Now, unbeknown to Lord Lilford, Fred had made some plans at this point, thinking, well, if I'm going to get this aircraft, I need somewhere to put it. And he'd spoken to the RAF and the guys at RAF Scampton about how he would take the aircraft apart and where he'd move it to. And he'd made some plans with the RAF that they would take it apart, they would bring all the knowledge and the know-how how to take it apart, and it would be moved to RAF Scampton. Slightly after that, Lord Lilford was thinking about selling the aircraft because he was paying all this money out on land rent for it to sit on, but doing nothing with it. And when he found out of this opportunity of taking the aircraft to RAF Scampton, free land rent, all he had to do was get it over there. He decided that he would do that. He would go into the partnership with the RAF, and he would arrange for it to be the gate guard at RAF Scampton. So Fred was quite integral in actually getting the aircraft over to RAF Scampton, which some of you may well have seen it there as you were passing on the road. So, time passes a little bit. Fred and Harold thought, well, if the aircraft's already at RAF Scampton, we may well get the offer of it a little bit later on. They're getting quite big into poultry, decided they needed to expand the poultry business. So the land at the old RAF East Kirkby, where we are now, came up for sale. We were actually told about the sale of the land by a gentleman called Den Brown. Now, Den Brown is still very well known to us. He actually lives on site of the airfield here. He told Fred that the airfield was coming up for sale, and Fred and Harold decided they would buy it, put up poultry houses on it, and save the original RAF base section here, which we're sat on, and kind of preserve it for the future. So that included the concrete base for the hangar, it included the control tower, the toilet blocks, a majority of the concrete that you see within the centre now. So it was, the land was purchased, the poultry business was set up, and that was in 1981. And the control tower was rescued from demolition, which it was likely going to happen to it to relieve the ground for arable farming. So for Den Brown, because he'd told us about it, we let him buy one of the small bungalows that was on the site so he could live on the airfield as a reward kind of for helping us to save the airfield. So the poultry business grew up, the poultry farm grew, and we started to restore some of the buildings. So the original control tower there, that was one of the buildings that we set our sights on restoring. So here you can see this is the airfield in the mid to early 80s when we purchased it. Control tower top left was in a completely derelict condition. Outside doesn't look too bad, but inside is completely derelict. This on the top right here is a hangar base, which was in the field behind the control tower. So if any of you have come to events and gone into the overflow car park, you're actually parking on top of where that hangar base was. We didn't purchase that field when we bought the rest of the museum site, and the hangar base was peeled up and taken away, along with a lot of the perimeter tracks and runway sections. So if ever you've driven around the A1, you've probably driven on a piece of East Kirkby hardcore. Bottom right here is a small toilet block. You won't necessarily recognise that, but that's the one that's beside the control tower. So female this side, male that side. It's been slightly extended, but that's what we started with before putting the toilets in. And then bottom left there's another shot of the same hangar base. So The business was growing. The museum wasn't a museum at that point. We just owned the land, and we thought it's a good place to bring the Lancaster if we ever do get offered it. Obviously, to do that, we would need to put a hangar up. So this is the Lancaster stood at RAF Scampton. It's 1988. We were actually offered the Lancaster in 1982. So Lord Lilford rang up Fred and said, it's about time I sold you that Lancaster. So they managed to agree a price. Fred went to see the bank manager. I'm sure the bank manager rolled his eyes. They managed to buy the aircraft, but they had to arrange moving it here to RAF East Kirkby as was. And they put the hangar up. They brought the Lancaster here. It actually moved here in 1987, 1988, early 1988. The aircraft itself hadn't really been in a hangar until it came here, so it had been stood outside for the majority of its life. We were quite fortunate in that before the RAF put the aircraft out on the gate at RAF Scampton, they actually did quite a major overhaul of her. So they did a complete paint strip, they took her apart, they inhibited her, put her back together again, painted her and put her out on the gate. And they actually used a reddy brown spray that they put over her, which we refer to as oxblood, and it's a very strong preservative, and we'll come back to that a little bit later on. So the aircraft stood there at RAF Scampton. As I said, I'm sure a lot of you will have seen the aircraft if you drove past RAF Scampton. At that point, the RAF didn't actually want Fred and Harold to move the aircraft and bring it here to East Kirkby, so they made various offers of how they would keep it at RAF Scampton and what they would do to her. But Fred and Harold had it set that they were going to bring her here. On the balcony of the control tower, they stood there one day and said, if we can get that Lancaster here, there'll be nothing else like it in the world. And I think they were right. I don't think there is really anything else like the aviation centre here. It's very unique seeing an original wartime Lancaster on the original wartime airfield where they served. So it actually took about 16 years from Fred first seeing the Lancaster to getting it here to East Kirkby. And for me, that's a bit of commitment and a bit of effort, that, for 16 years to be holding in your sights of the dream that you have to set this up, bring this aircraft and have it as a memorial to Christopher and the men of Bomber Command. So actually moving the aircraft, again we spoke to the RAF and they were very willing to help us to move the aircraft. They actually sent 11 men to take the aircraft apart. The group of men were called Crash and Smash. It's actually a part of the RAF that go over and take apart wrecked aircraft and rescue them, bring them back to RAF stations. I'm not sure Crash and Smash is the official term. I think it's what they were given the nickname of. They weren't too bad with this aircraft though, they were quite kind in the way they took it apart. So it actually took 7 Queen Mary loads. This is a Queen Mary, so it's the trailer itself. So it took 7 Queen Mary trailer loads to bring her here to East Kirkby. And it took 11 men, 14 weeks to take her apart, bring her and put her back together again. So here she is on the majority of her brought into the hangar. If you look at this photo down the bottom, this is actually on that half of the hangar base. When we originally put the hangar up in the 80s, we only put half of the hangar up. So where you can see the double stanchion there, we only had the first half of the hangar, which was sufficient to keep the aircraft in. It was only in about 2000 when we put the other half of the hangar up. So she was brought over by the RAF and put back together again. This is her in the hangar. You can see she's in her major sections. So the Lancaster is sectional. She basically unbolts and then bolts back together again. And that was originally from production. They had many production sites around the country where different sections of the aircraft were built, then brought together on trailers, put together, and then flown off to the airfield where they would be sited. Another photo of the aircraft coming together. You can see she's being craned together and bolted together. Not in a too dissimilar configuration to how she is now. And then the aircraft was finally completed, and we see here some of the crew members who completed the aircraft, and a gentleman called Keith Coldren, who at that time was looking after the site for us, while Fred and Harold looked after the poultry. So at this point, the original plan was we were just going to keep the aircraft in the hangar and come and have a look at it when we wanted, as you do. So we had put the hangar up, brought the aircraft in, and we thought high days and holidays, if anybody came round to see the family, we could bring them over, let them have a look at the Lancaster, and really take it in. But people were said, you can't do that. You can't just lock the aircraft away. You've got to let people see it. Because people have got to experience it and appreciate it for what it is. So it was decided then that, yeah, we'd open it up to the public could come and have a look. Didn't know how that was going to go, of course. Didn't know if anybody would actually come and have a look at it. So it was quite a major step to actually, obviously, invest all this money in purchasing the aircraft, bringing it here, putting it in the hangar, putting the hangar up, and then deciding that, yes, we'll open it up to the public to see if anybody actually wants to come and have a look. Fred had quite a few comments from this operation he was doing, spending all this money, bringing it here, investing in this work. The bank manager said to him, well, you've done it, Fred, and you've still got your health. And somebody else said to him, well, you've done it, Fred, and you've still got your wife, which they were more surprised about. Okay, so it came to the day to open the museum. So we have Fred, we have Harold Panton, Betty Panton, who's Fred's wife, and Lucy Panton, who's Harold's wife. We also have, for those of keen of eye, that nose there is mine. And the lady, or the little girl just there, is Louise. And I don't know if any of you will know Louise. Louise works in the office with us. She's my sister. She just had a baby, in fact, last night. Okay, so Keith Cauldron here, who was helping to run the site with us, and we've got several veterans as well. There's Buck Buckley there, Ron Mundy there, and John Chatterton. And John Chatterton and Ron Mundy and Buck actually flew from East Kirkby during the war. So we'd opened it up, obviously the official cutting there of the string across. So this was 1988. The original pay desk or admissions desk is that one there. So you just come past, look at Mum in the little hut there, pay your admission of a couple of pounds and come and have a look at the Lancaster. Of course, there was nothing else really in the hangar except for a couple of bomb trolleys, none of the displays around the side or anything. So in 30 years, the centre has grown quite considerably. So obviously, it was a success. Some people did come and have a look, and more people each year, thankfully. So I've got a short video here, which was filmed once the aircraft was complete and the museum had been opened. Hopefully it's going to work for you.
Lincolnshire brothers Fred and Harold Panton have made their fortune chicken farming. Tucked away in another shed, however, a much larger bird takes pride of place. During the war, East Kirkby was one of over 40 Bomber Command air bases in Lincolnshire. The Panton brothers preserved the aerodrome as a home for their prized possession, a 1945 Avro Lancaster.
Well, we did live here as lads during the war, during the blackout, of course, and we can remember the Lancasters taking off and going on bombing raids and coming back early mornings, and it's always a strange feeling to me to come out the house when it was pitch black and see the runway with a flare path lit up. That's the relevance of this Lancaster being here today, I suppose.
We feel so proud of those men that in the 50 years ago, what they was doing, because we saw it with our own eyes. And as I keep repeating myself, you cannot speak highly enough of those chaps, because they would have gone for those bombing raids, even if they knew they weren't going to come back.
In fact, half of the young men in Bomber Command didn't come back from operations. Fred and Harold's brother, Chris, was amongst them.
Sure, if it wasn't for my brother Chris, none of this would have happened today. Well, he got lost on the worst raid during the war, the Nuremberg raid on the 30th and 31st of March 1944. He's on his last operation. When we look at this aircraft, we think of someone. That's what it's all about.
There are only 2 airworthy Lancasters in the world. The Panton brothers' dream is to one day make it 3. Until then, they can make do with a familiar sound from their childhood, the music of 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines.
So here we have it, the aircraft completed. Fred and Harold sat on the David Brown tractor and just towed her out of the hangar. You'll see on the side of the aircraft we've had LEC painted on. So that's the 630 Squadron who were based here at East Kirkby during the Second World War. And the opposite side had DXC, which was the 57 Squadron that were based here as well. So obviously the aircraft was complete, stood out in the hangar here at East Kirkby. Fred and Harold seem to have had many questions posed to them over the time, and they seem to come in sections. So the first question was, are you going to let people come to see it? The second question was, well, are you going to get it running? And then the third question was, well, when are you going to fly it? So we're at second question point this time, are you going to get it running? So Fred and Harold toyed with the idea. They thought, well, we could give it a bit of a go, I guess, see if the engines will run. At this point, the Lancaster hadn't been running for 23 years. She had been well preserved, stood at RAF Scampton, and the engines had all been sprayed and inhibited with this oxblood that I've spoken about. So quite fortuitously, not too long after this time, there was a gentleman called Ian Hickling came and saw Fred and said, do you want me to get the Lancaster running for you? And Ian at that time was late 20s, early 30s, and as you can imagine, Fred said, well, I don't think you can do it. But Fred rang up Barry Sears, who was the warrant officer of the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight at RAF Coningsby, because Ian, of course, claims that he'd worked for 8 years on the BBMF. And Fred said, do you know Ian Hickling? He says, he called me saying he can get this Lancaster running. He says, is he capable? And Barry said, oh yeah, I know him, and if he can't, I'll kick his ass. And so Fred and Harold set Ian on. They set him on along with a gentleman called Roy Jarman, who was mainly airframes orientated, but they worked together on the engines. It took them, I think I'm right in saying, about 1,250 hours to get number 3 to a position where it was going to be running. So number 3 is the starboard inner engine. It runs the hydraulics, the compressors, so it's kind of the main engine on the aircraft. So in 1994, they got the first engine running. They didn't have any ground equipment, so they didn't have any safety raisers or anything, so they decided they'd bring the old Dexter tractor off the farm with the hydraulic scissor lift trailer, and they'd lift Ian and Roy up to the engines to work on it that way. The first thing they did is take the spark plugs out and try turning the engine over. So they took the spark plugs out, reduced the compression, turned the engine using the prop, and the big end, the pistons went up and down. And at that point they knew that the engines had been quite well preserved, the pistons weren't stuck in the liners or anything, and it was quite a good chance they'd be able to get her running. So I said about 1,200 hours to get number 3 running, which they successfully did. When they started her up, it was just taking her up in RPM, so very low RPM, and then just bringing it up and up to get the engine running again, so to speak. So once they got one running, they thought, well, we might as well go for 2, and they started number 2. At this point, there was a gentleman called Flight Lieutenant Mike Chatterton, who was flying the Battle of Bristol Memorial Flight Lancaster at the time. His father was John Chatterton, who was here at the opening, who had also flown Lancasters. So there's a father and son partnership there, both flew Lancasters. I don't think there's many in the world that can claim that one. So Mike got involved with the museum, having a look at what we were doing, keeping in touch, to the point where we thought, well, if we've got 2 engines running, we can probably start thinking about taxiing her. So they attached a few more pipes, checked some brake bags, did a bit more work to the aircraft, and started to look at taxiing her on 2 engines. So they just used the inboards. Once they'd done their taxi test, they thought, well, this is viable. We could actually taxi the Lancaster, and they worked on getting the outboards running as well, so the 2 outboard engines. And all the engines were really running within about a 6-month period, so it's quite a short period to getting the aircraft live again. So we'll move on to the next little video that I have.
Responsibility for taxiing such a unique aircraft had to be undertaken by an experienced Lancaster pilot. There was only one man for the job.
The idea of actually operating 2 Lancasters is obviously fantastic. I feel very honoured to be able to operate 1, but to actually operate 2 and within such a short distance. But this one, I would say, is even more important to me in that it's such a family connection, in that my father used to operate and fly Lancasters from here 50 years ago, and to be able to do the same with another Lancaster at the same airfield, just 50 years later, it's a thing that nobody would ever have dreamt of, I imagine. Starting 3, Mask back on. Throttle set. Clear 3, switches on 3, and turning 3. And stop on 2. Mask back on 2. Throttle set. On 2, clear 2, and turning 2. Big taxi. Okay, tower coming up.
So you can see from that video things have changed here a little bit. There's no ropes up, no barriers or anything like that, so anyone could have, anybody on, well, not that many people on site at that time, obviously we weren't particularly getting a lot of visitor numbers. But that was one of the first taxi tests, just on the inboards, as you could have seen. No hydraulics working, so the bomb doors couldn't be closed or anything like that. So it went from that to 1995. We decided that we could start offering taxi rides on board the aircraft, so people could actually go on board the aircraft while it was running and go for a ride on board. So 1995 we started that, and it's just become more and more regular as the years have gone on. So after the question of, are you going to get a taxiing, the next question was, well, what else can you do? What more can you do to progress the aircraft? And the next step for us was a tail-up taxi run. In the year 2000, we had the BBC approach us because they wanted to film a documentary drama called Night Flight, and it was a wartime-based drama with flicking back from modern day to wartime. And one of the things they wanted to do was a simulated takeoff of an aircraft, of a Lancaster, on a bomber station. So they approached us to see if we could go to the next level of actually lifting the tail on the aircraft to get to a tail-up taxi run position. With the filming of that, they filmed to get a tail up, and then from that they went then to a model as it took off. So yeah, we decided that we would give it a go. We would take the next step to getting a tail-up taxiable. Really the biggest thing there was attaching the flying controls, so the ailerons, elevators, rudders, making sure all that was okay, making sure the engines were okay, going up to the extra power that was required. I think it was about 0 boost on all 4 engines, which is about 2,000, 2,200 RPM. So that was 2000. 2001, February, extremely cold. We went out onto the old 4,000 feet of runway that's left on the far side of the airfield, the other side of the road. Took her out there and did quite a few tail-up taxi runs for the filming. Speed, where the tail came up, was about 30 miles an hour, and it got up to about 50 to 60 miles an hour in the entire run before the tail came down, the brakes were put on, and the brow was mopped. So 2001, February we did that, brought her back into the hangar, and as we brought her into the hangar it started to snow, so you can tell how cold it was when we were doing that. This photo was actually taken in, I think it's 2006, and this is out on the grass strip. We decided to try it out on the grass strip, see how she fared out on the grass as opposed to concrete, see if we could get the tail up still. So that's back in 2006. And photos taken from the top of the control tower. So the next video is, or should be, is the tail up run. You'll notice here that Mike is forcing the tail up, so in a moment you'll see him push the control column forwards and they're pulling the brakes. For me, when you watch that, it's the engine note, the change in the engine sound when it's actually doing some work and the tail comes up. It's a different sound altogether to what you'll hear from the Lancaster while she's taxiing out here. And you just feel like she's just a microsecond away from taking off. Now, we get quite a few comments of, oh, it's just two farmers playing with a Lancaster at an airfield at East Kirkby. If that's playing with a Lancaster, yeah, that's not going too bad, is it? Okay, so we come to 2009. So we've got the Lancaster, she's together, she's working. You can get her to the stage where she's doing a tail-up taxi run. So everybody's now asking, when are you going to get a flying? Are you going to get a flying? So just to let you know who's on this photo, we've got Pat Ellis, who's a ground crew member, there's Louise Bush, there's Fred, there's Ian Hickling, Mike Chatterton, myself, Roy Jarman. So 2009, Fred was invited to go on BBC Radio Lincolnshire and have an interview and a talk about the Lancaster and the site here, have a recap on what we're doing. And unbeknown to the rest of us, he decided he was going to tell everyone that we were going to get it flying. So we all listened, we all heard it, I'm sure it happened, we all heard it. So from 2009, it was public that that's what we were going to do, we were going to get the aircraft airworthy. So from 2009 to 2014, we were working on background work. What's the first thing you want to get if you're going to get the aircraft flying? And we decided the best thing to do, the first thing to do, is to make sure we've got the engines. So we put in an order for 4 airworthy engines with Morris Hammond at iTech Engineering. And over a period of 5 years, I think it was, he overhauled 4 engines for us. We bought 2 originally from Morris to be overhauled. We bought 1 from Carolyn Grace, who has a 2.6 Spitfire, and one of them was one of ours from here at East Kirkby. It was originally the number 4 that was fitted. So we sent those away. Obviously, we had them overhauled. They're now in stores, in the bonded store, in temperature and humidity controlled environment, all inhibited, ready to go. So after we got the engine sorted, we thought they're money in the bank, £125,000 each. You're not going to lose any money on them. So £500,000 for all 4 engines. The next step was the logistics around getting her airworthy. What do we need to do in order to facilitate this work happening? So we worked for several years making sure we had sufficient drawings, we had sufficient knowledge about the aircraft and about Lancasters in general and how they should be overhauled. One of the things we managed to do was to receive all of the main spar jigs from the RAF. When they changed the spar on PA474, the rear bottom boom they changed, all of the spar drawings and measurements were made from our Lancaster, ready for making the jig. So we knew that that main spar jig would fit our Lancaster. So we thought, before they disposed of it, best thing to do is to offer to look after it for them, so we could use it in the future if we needed to. And we brought that here, must have been about 2006, 2007. And we've really been buying up spares and parts in the meantime ever since. One of the things we did was I flew out with Ian to Canada. We went to Alberta in Canada to Nanton, and we brought back about 3.5 engines worth of engine bearers and about 4 aircrafts worth of undercarriage for those to be overhauled and give us serviceable spares in bonded store ready for the day when we fly here. We also bought up 9 propeller blades from Tampa Bay, Florida. How they came to be out there, I don't really know, but we bought 9 Lancaster blades to give us a new old stock of those. So they're never used. They're in fact the same blade as on a particular mark of Corsair, believe it or not. And they're also the same blade that's fitted to the Mosquito. So those are in stores, ready, waiting to go. We've bought brand new tyres from Dunlop. They still make the tyres. They're the largest aircraft tyre in production still. So we've been working towards that day when we push the button and actually start the restoration work on the aircraft. Fred, of course, alluded to that slightly earlier than we were perhaps expecting. Okay, so what's the first thing you need to do if you're going to start to restore the aircraft? And the first thing is to assess the aircraft, to survey the Lancaster. So, it's quite a long story, this one, but we got some quotes for paint stripping the aircraft and repainting her, so it gives us a chance to actually survey the aircraft, the skins, all the rivets and things like that. We got a quote and it was coming in at £125,000 to paint strip and repaint the aircraft. We were quite fortunate in the fact that we have a gold member of the centre called Armand Lloyd. Armand Lloyd works on a business down in London, but he's also interested, obviously, in Lancasters, and he wanted to try and help us in any way he can. He saw on eBay there was a large box of gauges and instruments for a Lancaster that were up for sale. He contacted and said, "Do you want me to buy them for you? Are they any good to you?" To which we said, "Yeah, by all means, please do." So he bought them. They're actually over in Ireland. He bought them and had them posted. and that caused them quite a lot of issues because gauges and instruments are radioluminescent, so they've got a radioactive paint. So of course all the alarms went off when they came through the postal system. The box had to be completely taken apart, everything wrapped in lead, reboxed and sent back. So eventually they were delivered here to East Kirkby. And through all the conversations that Armand had with the seller of these items, the seller asked him, what on earth do you want them for? What are you going to do with them? To which Armand told him, of course, they were coming here to the Lancaster here at East Kirkby. And it turned out that the person who was selling them, his father flew Lancasters, I think it was 518 Squadron, during the Second World War. He was an Irishman, and it turns out, as coincidence have it, that he ran a huge aircraft painting company called Mass Aviation, MAAS, based out in Holland, in Alabama in America, and in Ireland as well. And this gentleman called Tim said, is there anything I can do to help? Is there anything I can do? And we said, well, as coincidence has it, we've just had a quote for repainting a Lancaster. How do you fancy doing it? So he says, yeah, we'll organise to come and paint strip and repaint your Lancaster for as cheap as we possibly can. So in the winter of 2016, it took about 2 years to arrange actually how we're going to do it and facilitating doing it. The winter of 2016, they sent a team of 8 gentlemen, all of different nationalities, Polish, Irish, British, Lithuanian, all sorts of different nationalities, brought them over from Holland with all the associated gubbins that they required to paint strip the Lancaster. We got a couple of different sponsors on board. One of them was Akzo Nobel for the paint, and another one was a scaffolding company to scaffold it all around the aircraft, ready for paint stripping her. Unfortunately, the scaffolding company pulled out the week before, so it left us a little bit high and dry with absolutely no means of getting up to the aircraft to paint strip her. So we eventually managed to hire in a load of safety razors, electric scissor lifts, to enable us to do the work. So on these photos here, you'll see the aircraft being completely paint stripped with a chemical stripper all the way down to bare aluminium. We found that there were about 4 or 5 layers of paint, either black and camouflage, and about 8 to 10 layers on the roundels. So you can imagine I know some fairly good foreign swear words now. The aircraft was completely paint stripped down, and when the Lancaster was brought here to East Kirkby, it had the squadron codes of YFC, which was the station flight at RAF Scampton. And we never paint stripped the aircraft before this position we're talking here, so it had always been painted over the top of. So when we put the DXC onto the aircraft, we just painted over the YFC, and when we then moved on to the DXF and the LEH, we just painted over again. So there's lots of layers of paint on there. I suspect if you were RAF Scampton and you were in Jankers or you'd done something wrong as an RAF serviceman, the punishment was to go and paint the roundel on the Lancaster. And I think by the judgment of how much paint was on there, there's a lot of dodgy airmen at Scampton at the time, because there was an awful lot of work to try and get the paint off those roundels. So they eventually got to it, got all the paint off. We allowed originally 2 weeks to take the aircraft apart before the paint strip. The plan was to take the turrets off, take the bomb doors off, the undercarriage doors, the elevators, the rudders, not the rudders, sorry, the elevators, yeah, the rudders, the turrets, everything was to come off to leave a bare aircraft so that items could be paint stripped on the floor and the aircraft could be paint stripped in situ. We allowed 2 weeks for that. It actually only took us about a week, so we were a week ahead of schedule. They came in, paint stripped the aircraft, and it took them 12 days to paint strip the aircraft, so they allowed a week. So we lost that week straight away that we'd originally gained. The chemical paint stripper was, shall we say, it was good for the first coat, no good for the second coat, but very good on the third coat. So they had a lot of problems actually applying the stripper to get the paint off. It's sprayed on, you allow it to work, it effectively lifts a layer of paint and then you scrape it off. So it's a very manual, labour-intensive job. I said they sent 8 men and it took 12 days. So once the aircraft was completely paint stripped, it's then washed off with a soapy fluid, a soapy water-based liquid, which actually takes the acidity out of the paint stripper and neutralises it. So it's all washed down, and then from that point we got the aircraft back to survey her and to work on her to do the work that we thought would be required. So this is the aircraft in a cleaned down state. One of the main jobs we had, we found quite a lot of surface corrosion on her. and that had to be removed using little rubber wheels with little rubber fingers on it, and that just agitates the surface and removes the surface corrosion. So we had the entire Lancaster to run over with that to clean any surface corrosion off. Where we actually found to be the worst area was underneath the wings and on top of the wings where the original black paint had been when the aircraft was painted white. So we don't know whether that black paint has attracted moisture and locked moisture in and caused corrosion, or if it's something to do with the exhaust gases where they go over and under the wings, which has affected the aluminium. So there's quite a lot of work removing corrosion there, many man hours to actually do that. One of the main jobs we wanted to do while the aircraft was in this state, other than the survey, was to replace a lot of anchor nut strip. So there's a lot of panels on the aircraft which are held on by steel anchor nuts and also by rows of rivets. And something that's called up in the modern paperwork for looking after a Lancaster is to remove a set of panels that hold the trailing edge to the wing. And those originally all held on by rivets. So in order to facilitate these panels coming on and off very regularly, we'd have to replace all those rivets with screws using anchor nuts. So those anchor nut strips had to be specially produced. They cost £12,000 for all the anchor nut strip, and they took a lot of that winter period actually putting those anchor nut strips in. So that's just one piece of work that no one will ever see again. We know it's happened, and we've certainly paid for it. And so that's a survey of the aircraft and some airframe work replacing skins that were too badly corroded was the majority of what happened during that winter period. A few figures here. So during the paint strip and repaint, we used 2,000 metres of polythene, 100 rolls of masking tape, 1,020 litres of paint stripper, and then for the repaint there was 80 litres of primer, 60 litres of black paint, 20 litres of green paint, and 20 litres of dark earth. There was 640 man-hours of corrosion removal, and down the bottom here you see this is what they're doing. This is Liz, this is Gary, and they've got these little wheels on the end of windies, of polishing guns, just agitating the skin, removing any corrosion until you get down to the good material underneath. There was 1,680 man-hours to strip, clean and repaint. It took 12 days to paint strip, and we used 200 of those corrosion removal discs and a lot of elbow grease. So one of the problems we had, this is some paint here that was used on the aircraft. The paint sponsor was Akzo Nobel, as I said earlier. We told them the square area of the aircraft, and they worked out how much paint we would need. Unfortunately, there were only about 25% of what we needed. So when the aircraft turned up with 8 men willing to put the paint on the aircraft, we were slightly short. So here we are with a huge tent that they put up around the top of the aircraft to enable us to repaint her in. That tent there is inflated. If you turned the heaters off, all the polythene sunk to the bottom. So it's the hot air in there, a bit like a hot air balloon, which is actually creating the tent structure. So the paint team turned up, they opened the primer, started applying the primer. You see this is all the yellow primer on the aircraft, and that went perfectly. They were just slightly short, but they had some in stock, so they brought it and they finished the priming of the aircraft. When it came to actually opening up the paint that was supplied, as I say, there was only about a quarter of what we needed, and it was also matte. And matte paint was no good for the application that we needed. We wanted it about 20% satin rather than black, so it's a lot harder wearing. It also doesn't scuff and damage quite as easily as matte paint. So that causes a huge problem because we were at the end of our winter period basically. The last thing to do was to paint the aircraft, and then you could engine test to roll her out for taxi runs. So with the lack of paint, bearing in mind there's a 6-week lead time on order of aircraft paint, we contacted the company that originally supplied it, and they couldn't make it for at least 6 weeks. It was probably going to be closer to 10, which would have meant that we would have lost about 3 weeks of the first taxi runs of the season. So it's a no-go for us, we couldn't do it. We approached another company, who were a paint company, do paint for aircraft, and again they were going to be a 6-week lead time, but they might be able to get us some matte paint a little bit quicker if we wanted any of that. So we had quite a few calls between us, conference calls, if I was at home and got a call or anything like that, talking between us all, deciding actually what was the next process, what were we going to do. One of the ideas we flirted with was painting her completely white, like she would have been when she was out in the Pacific. We could have painted her in the matte paint and then put a lacquer over the top, which would have made it a satin sheen. But then we decided actually if we did that and the lacquer was scraped off, it would just leave matte paint underneath, so that was no good. Eventually, it became public that we had this problem with the paint. I spoke to Radio Lincolnshire again, and they put out the fact that this had happened, and we only had a small percentage of the paint that we required, and the project was at a halt until we could sort it out. And luckily for us, Witham Oil and Paint, who's actually a local Lincolnshire company, gave me a ring and said, can we do the paint for you? What sort of paint do you need? And so we talked through it, we looked at data sheets, and we worked it all out, and yeah, they could have the paint made in about 3 days, and they would deliver it. That actually happened just prior to Easter. So we had a downtime of Easter, and then the paint team were going to come back the Tuesday after Bank Holiday Monday of Easter and start to paint the aircraft again. So we were very fortunate. The paint arrived on Good Friday, all ready for the paint team to start again on the Tuesday. So they came back from Holland, Denmark, wherever they were based, came in, cleaned the aircraft down again with a solvent cleaner, but scuffed the aircraft down, because once you've applied primer, you've only got a certain number of hours before you then put the top coat on top. If you don't meet that bracket of time, then you have to re-scuff the surface to have a good surface that the paint will etch to. So they repainted the aircraft. As I say, took that amount of paint. The paintman went home, and we allowed the paint to dry before we started to take down all of the polythene around her and get a good look at what the aircraft was going to look like. And she's here completely painted. You'll see here she's having the roundel and the letters painted on the side. This is some of the paint team, bottom left here. We gave them a free t-shirt, as you do. Thanks very much. So that's painting on all the roundels and the artwork. And then on the nose, we had a gentleman called Duncan Parker from Nottingham came and painted the nose art on for us. Now this nose art is slightly different to what was taken off, in the fact that we decided we would depict Chris's operations on the nose. So that's all of Chris's operations he did during wartime on Halifaxes. So the yellow ones are nighttime ops. The ice creams there are Italian operations. The swastika is for shooting down enemy aircraft. The red one is for a Berlin operation, and the key is for the 21st operation. Duncan put his own slant on the nose art, the Just Jane. You'll see it looks slightly different to what came off. He's had a little bit more depth to it and things, and every artist, of course, has their own take on what they're going to do. So that's how she rolled out in the spring of 2017. So the original quote to paint, strip and repaint the aircraft from another company was £125,000. Using Mass Aviation, we were enabled us to do it all for £20,000. So an absolute snip of what it was originally going to cost. The benefit, of course, doing all that was we did a survey of the aircraft. We knew what we needed to do to then make her airworthy, or at least the majority of what we needed to do to make her airworthy. From that point, we had to then decide on a plan going forward on how we're going to do it. We had to, of course, speak to the CAA and say, by the way, we want to restore our Lancaster to airworthy condition, what do you think? So we went down for a meeting with the CAA. They were very happy for us to do it, as long as, of course, we followed all the protocol and procedures that were required to restore an aircraft, whether it be a Lancaster, a Spitfire, a Hurricane, anything of that sort. What we've come across with the Lancaster is because it weighs so much, it actually comes into a similar category to a 737, 747 airliner. And what's required of the CAA licensed company here is the same as whether you're restoring or working on an airliner. So the way it's worked out is there are different companies within the CAA legislation licensing, and depending on what aircraft you work on, dictates what sort of company you have to set up. So for a Lancaster, you need an A823 company, so that's for a heavier aircraft, and effectively, with the approval of the company, we could say to them, we want to now work on a Boeing 747. Not that we get it in here, but we would need to be able to prove that we could do it effectively, but it's the same license as required, the same company approval that's required for a Lancaster as something a bit bigger and a bit more modern than that. So we started thinking, how are we going to actually do the work? What's the best thing to start on? What's the best part of the aircraft, or what needs to work first? So from the survey, we found where the wooden parts of the aircraft were. And believe it or not, a Lancaster does have wooden parts, even though it's the size that it is. So the wood on an aircraft that's 70 years old and that's been open to the elements because it's been stood outside the majority of its life tends to deteriorate. And we found that the worst parts of the wood on the aircraft were actually the leading edges of the fin. So on the starboard side of the aircraft, the front edge of the tail fin, that's actually got a mahogany leading edge, which the skins are screwed to. Mahogany is a controlled substance now, so we couldn't use mahogany, so we used ash. And so the first thing we thought we would do is we've got to tackle these wooden areas, because if we don't take them apart, they'll find their own way apart in the next few years. So we thought the first thing to do is tail fins. So what's the plan? A Lancaster is a sectional aircraft. So as you can see here, if you can decipher this plan, this is out of the AP 2062, which is basically the Bible on Lancasters. It's the manual for working on a Lancaster. It tells you everything about it. So you see, a Lancaster is a sectional aircraft, so it's built in sections, brought together, bolted together and flown. So it has major sections: the cockpit, the centre section, the mid-section, the tail section, bomb doors, tail fin, rudder, elevator, tailplane, and then the plan view of the trailing edges come off separate, the wingtip, and then you have the engine bearers and subframes, and the engine nacelles. So we thought, working from this, we'll break the aircraft down into major sections and work on a section at a time. The biggest problem we have here at East Kirkby is, to pay for the restoration, we have to taxi the aircraft. So we have 6 months of taxiing, raising funds, 6 months of actually doing the work. So everything has to be taken down to bite-sized pieces to actually eventually end up with a completely restored aircraft. That posed quite a head scratcher to the CAA, because they're used to an aircraft coming offline, being taken apart, restored, put together again, and flown and finished. Whereas we've turned around and said to them, oh no, we don't want to do it like that. That's too easy. What we want to do is we want to take a bit off, restore it, put it back on. And they said, well, you're taking a bit off, making it airworthy, and as soon as you bolt it back on a non-airworthy aircraft, it's no longer airworthy. So there's been quite a head scratch as to how we're actually going to do the paperwork around doing the job this way. We've come up with a way of doing it, and in fact we've got another CAA inspection at the end of this month, inspecting the site and the work that we're doing. But at the moment, people seem happy with how it's progressing and how we're actually going to do it. The way that we've decided we're going to do this work, with doing it sectionally each winter, means that everything comes together by year, the final year, which I'll talk about in a minute, and everything is effectively, when it's off the aircraft, it's airworthy, when it's put on, it's not. But everything will then be airworthy by the final year. And the way that, with the CAA's agreement here, what we're going to do is, in the final year, we'll actually do like the Battle Britain Royal Flight Lancaster do, which is a major overhaul. And so with that, everything is inspected and signed off. So we will take the item off, say the fin, take the item off, bust it down, restore it, put it back together again, put it on the aircraft with all of the current paperwork all signed off. Then what we'll do is, in the final year, is we open it up with the inspection panels, look at it and say, yes, it's still airworthy, we'll sign it off. And then that final document is the airworthiness of the aircraft. So we've made the plan as to what year we're going to do what section. So year 0 was the paint strip and survey. That's the basis of the work going ahead. Year 1, which was last year, was the starboard tail fin and rudder, so on the starboard side of the aircraft. Starboard undercarriage to come off, and the undercarriage support beams to be NDT'd and checked. The undercarriage support beams are really large cast items or forged items, and they hold the undercarriage. They also are the pickup points for the engines, and they bolt back to the main spar. So they're kind of integral to the strength of the aircraft itself. So starboard side, year 1, they came off, were NDT'd and gone back on as airworthy items, or sufficient for airworthy. The subframe for the engine bearers and the bulkhead to come off for inspection. And then the removal of the starboard trailing edge. So the trailing edge basically bolts onto the back of the wing. It's this section here. So removal of that to inspect the web of the rear spar. So the first 2 years, and we're in year 2 now, are basically identical except for on opposite sides of the aircraft. So what we've learned from doing the starboard side and the parts we've had to produce for that, we've then also been able to produce for the port side, ready for the work on the port side, which is currently undergoing, although it's all in a box at the moment, so you can't really see it. So year 3 is rear fuselage. So we're looking at transportation joint where the H2S is, so the blister underneath the aircraft, that point rearwards. So what we'll have to do is we'll have to jack the aircraft up. So the centre section, the main wing section is jacked up. The rear section is then craned up onto a high trestle, and a trestle is put in just forward of the H2S, and then the rear fuselage section is pulled away on wheels and lowered down. What we found with this aircraft, which is probably the biggest job, is the fact that it was built with mag alloy rivets. So the mag alloy rivet tends to degrade over a period of time. So we've decided that what we're going to do is replace every rivet on the aircraft with Hidaminium modern rivets. That's going to mean that the life of this aircraft is going to extend exponentially. It's going to be good for decades to come. We thought we'd do the job once and do it now rather than having to come back in 20 years' time and do it again. So the biggest job, of course, other than bringing the aircraft part onto a jig to make sure it doesn't move, is to drill out all of the rivets and place new rivets in. The top of the rear fuselage has extremely long skins. I think they're about 15 feet, 11 to 15 feet the skins on the top. So we're going to try and keep as many of those as we can, because actually getting aluminium now in sheet aluminium of that sort of length is quite tricky. And then the skins on the sides are slightly shorter, and they're all done in thin sections. So we can't do one skin at the front and then move on. It's basically a skin that travels the majority of the length of the fuselage. So we're going to have to kind of work as we go along. We'll take a skin off. The main reason for taking the skins off is to check the area between the skin and the former within the aircraft, so that it forms the shape and the stringers, to make sure there's no corrosion between the two faces. What you generally find between two faces that join is you get moisture trapped between the two, and then it forms corrosion. So you get a white powder that forms between the two faces, and that is corrosion. It's a bit like rust on steel, but it's on aluminium. So we've got to take all the skins off, check all the structure, make sure it's okay, then rivet either the original skins back on if they're okay, or new skins on where the skins are no longer usable, and replacing all those rivets. There was a Canadian advert during the Second World War saying there's 1 million rivets in a Lancaster. So if you give me 10 years, I'll let you know. So once the rear section is done, bolted back on, ready for taxiing in the May, and we go to year 4, which is the centre, the mid section, if you like, which is where the roundel and all the letters are on the aircraft. Very similar process to the rear section. Of course, the mid of the turret's within that section. And what you'll eventually find if you come each year is the aircraft will progress further forward, and we'll be dotting around the aircraft each year, restoring different sections. Year 5 is quite a big year. So this is the very nose section, the bomb aimer section. So that's where the bomb aimer kneels down, leans forward, and that's basically bolted onto the cockpit of the aircraft. So that's going to be coming off and being worked on. Same process all the way through. The wingtips will also come off, trailing edges will come off. What we found in the trailing edges, like the one over there, that's the inner trailing edge off the port side, is the extrusion, so the angled sections on the trailing edges are quite corroded. So there's something called dissimilar corrosion particularly on this Lancaster, where steel meets aluminium, and they react with each other and they cause you corrosion on the aircraft. So on the extrusion here, there's a section of it where it's been mated with steel, which has corroded, so that's no good for airworthy. So as time goes on, we've had to found an extrusion company. Extrusion is basically forcing metal through a die to make a particular shape. So we've got extrusions to make for the port tail fin, extrusions to make for the trailing edges, and also some stringers to make for the fuselage. So a lot of work at the moment that we're putting in is actually making those contacts, finding those people that can do the work, who are very few and far between. So 3 hours now will actually save time in the future, because we just ring them up and say we need more of whatever extrusion. So it's quite a slow process now, but actually speed up as we go along. So the trailing edges need quite a bit of work for extrusion replacement. The wingtips, where it meets the wing itself, is another piece of extrusion, and the bottom extrusion on those wingtips needs replacing as well. So we've got to find or have a die made for that angle of extrusion, have it all bent and rolled to the right size. So there's quite a lot of work in the trailing edges and the wingtips. But one thing we've found, which is a glorious piece of news, is that the rivets used in the trailing edges weren't mag alloy. It's about the only part of the aircraft that wasn't. Why they did, I don't know. So they possibly won't need completely re-riveting, but we have got to take the structure apart inside, clean it down, check it, and put it back together again. Okay, year 6 is a huge job, and that's the cockpit. There's loads of wires, connections, hydraulics, pneumatics, all in the cockpit area. The control panel is a huge job on its own. So the top of the canopy there, the front section is metal, the rear section is wood. That's all laminated wood. And of course, laminated wood over time delaminates. So we've got the wood to replace at the rear of the cockpit there. So that will be done. We'll have it made before the year actually comes to actually replacing it. Yeah, but the cockpit's a huge job, particularly when you look up in the bomb bay of the aircraft and see all the different faces that currently have paint on them, and have got to be paint stripped, inspected and repainted. So I shall be at the back of the queue when it comes to finding out who's going to be paint stripping the bomb bay. Year 7, tailplane and elevator. Tailplane has a spar in it, or 2 spars in it in fact, and they are limited to a certain number of hours. And of course any corrosion or any problems you find with them may dictate that the spars themselves have to be replaced. What we found within the tailplane as well is when the aircraft was stood at RAF Scampton, the control locks weren't in all the time, which has actually meant that the rudders were allowed to flap around. And that has also in turn damaged some of the structure within the tailplane. It's torn some of the formers in there because the control rods have been moving around beyond their, what they're allowed to effectively. So tailplanes, they will most likely be done away at somewhere like Arco, which is Aircraft Restoration Company down at Duxford. And elevators, we actually have a spare set of elevators which we may well restore in a summer period ready for the winter. So as you can see as we go along, we're eventually getting to a majority of the aircraft being made airworthy. The next job is the wings. Now wings are going to be a hell of a job, terrible job. They will go on to the jigs that we borrowed from BBMF, and they will be completely de-riveted and re-riveted. One of the major, I would call it a flaw, I'll put my neck out there and call it a flaw on a Lancaster, is it uses plug rivets. Now plug rivets are basically, the structure has or the spar, shall we say, has a hole drilled in it. That it's bottomed out, so it doesn't go all the way through the spar. It's part way into the spar. It's then tapped, so it has a thread tapped into it, and then you beat a rivet into it until it expands into the threads, which obviously stops it from coming out again. I'm sure it was a good idea at the time, but now coming to it, it's going to be a real bugbear for us. We came across them on the aileron, the port aileron, and we vowed never again. And they are basically the forward skins on top of the wings are plug riveted to the spar. The Canadians actually, when they built Mark 10 Lancasters, decided we won't use plug rivets, we'll just use screws. Now that's a brilliant idea. So we've actually managed, going back to ailerons, we've managed to find some Canadian ailerons, which we can use the forged section out of with machine screws in them. So at the moment, we're in discussion as to what we're going to do on the main planes with the use of either plug rivets or screws. So there may well be a modification going there to try and use screws as opposed to plug rivets. So we're going to do one winter on the starboard wing, one winter on the port wing. So they'll come off the aircraft, obviously the engine will come off the aircraft onto the jig, de-riveted, new skins where required, complete structure cleaned down, repaint, re-riveted, and of course all the fuel tank bays need work as well. At the point when we take them apart, we will see into areas that we cannot currently see. You can see quite a lot of the main spar sections and the wing sections, the webs, from the fuel tank bays. So there's 3 fuel tanks on each side, one on the centre section, and then 2 in the main plane wing section. So we've had those covers off, we've had a look inside the wing. You can only, of course, see so far. So we may get some nasty surprises when we actually start to de-skin the wing. We may find damage to spars, corrosion on spars, all sorts of things. So we're currently working on working out and facilitating the production of main spars if required. The main spars on a Lancaster are actually lifed differently depending on which part of spar it is. So the lowest spar on the aircraft is the bottom rear boom. So, best way to explain it, the Lancaster's got 4 booms in it, making 2 spars, a top and a bottom at the front and the back, joined by a web. And they're all lifed at different hours. The lifing was put on by British Aerospace, deemed to be the life taken from Shackleton, basically. Shackleton has a very similar spar to a Lancaster. I think it's the same extrusion and a slightly beefed up material, so stronger material. So they looked at the Shackleton, and when the BBMF Lancaster became airworthy and was flying and doing lots of hours, they decided, actually looking at this, we've got to work out what the fatigue is on this material, and then set a fatigue meter on the BBMF Lancaster, dictating how many hours it's allowed to fly before the spar's replaced. So there was no original lifing put on the spars by Avro, and in fact the Canadians don't have a life on their spars, it's purely on inspection. BBMF have the lifing, I think it's about 4,500 hours on the bottom rear boom, and it gets more and more, so I think it's about 5,400 hours on the top front boom, I think. And again, as you go out into the wing sections, the lifing changes on the booms as well. So this Lancaster's done 2,424 flying hours in a total, and it's also, of course, taxied around for however many years, 20 years. So there is a certain fatigue that's already on the spars, and a certain fatigue, the CAA believe, that has been put on the spars by taxiing the aircraft. So we are kind of working worst case scenario. If we do need spar boom material, we better actually have the ability to make it if we need it. So in fact, we are talking to a group out in Canada who are in a similar situation as to how we get some spar material passed on modification and also produced or extruded. So that's the next 2 years. So year 8 and 9 is the wing section. Then year 10 is the big one. It's the centre section. So if we do have to replace spars, this is a big part of it. The centre section is a very big piece. If you look at the Lancaster, where the wing itself actually tips up, so that's the start of the outer main plane where it joins the centre section, and the centre section comes just rear of the rear spar and just forward of the forward spar. And that, we've left the spar work till the end. And people have said, why have you left the spar work to the end? Generally, when you restore an aircraft, you start with the heart of it and work out, which on a Lancaster would be the main spars, and work out. We're working to a 10-year plan, as you can see here. We don't know what's going to happen in year 9. You might find that insurance companies will no longer insure vintage aircraft. You might find the CAA turn around and say, we're no longer going to allow aircraft of that period, that vintage, to fly. You may find that you can no longer get avgas, which is a possibility. So we are not going to possibly invest the hugest bulk of money in replacing spars if in year 1, if in actual fact in year 10 we can turn around and we can't fly it. If there is any damage to the spars, they're still perfectly fine for taxiing, just not good for airworthy. So we're biding our time, spending what money we have, replacing rivets and things which will fall apart in the end, before taking that big gulp, that big bite, and possibly looking at replacing spars. So that's why the heart of the aircraft is the last bit to be done. What money we have, we want to spend on bettering the aircraft as a whole, rather than one section of it. So I said about year 1 and 2, we've done tail fin, trailing edges. So the new tail fin skins going on, and the new tail fin wood, which is here. That's ash as opposed to mahogany, and that's laminated wood, so it's all over in sections. You can see here the bulkhead and the subframe. This is from number 3 engine. So we get asked quite a lot, what are the major problems that we actually found with the aircraft? And this is things that the surveys picked up, but also things we found as we started to take her apart. So that there is the head of a mag alloy rivet which has departed itself from the aircraft. So it should look like this with all the little heads. That's just chipped off. and that's what we're finding with the mag alloy rivets. When they actually reduce strength sufficiently, you can just get your fingernail under the head and just pick them off. And of course the structure is weakened by that point. If you lose enough of them, then the skin of the structure will actually start peeling away from the structure itself. So we've got a problem with mag alloy rivets. Let's say there's about 1 million on a Lancaster supposedly. We've got a problem with just stresses that are on the aircraft. Stresses that were countered by modifications as the years went on to these aircraft. So what you can see here is part of the rudder. So this is the forward face of the rudder, and the holes here and the section here is where the hinge actually bolts onto the rudder. And there's a modification which has been done to our starboard rudder, which wasn't done to the port rudder. We found that actually the two rudders, one is almost as modified as it could be when we took it apart, and the other one was barely modified at all. So we found the reason why they modified it, and that is things like the crack here. If you can just see here, there's a crack which is extended from the holes in the mounting. So this is a piece of sheet aluminium which is bent over at the sides, and then the hinge is bolted through. So obviously with the stresses on the aircraft, the stresses are flying, the forces, it's actually produced a crack from down the side of the material there from the holes. That's on the port rudder. On the starboard rudder, it's got aluminium inserts on the inside of that curve, which actually strengthens the material up. So I'm sure we're going to find this as we go throughout the aircraft, that modifications are put in place throughout the life of Lancaster as a whole that haven't necessarily been put in place on ours. We're quite fortunate that we've got a Mark 7 Lancaster, which is like the GT version, the most modified version. It should have the majority of the modifications that were put into place. So hopefully there's very little of this that goes on. So we're encountering cracks, and we found that actually on the tail fin there's quite a few cracks in areas where there's been high stress. You'll also find there's areas where there were strengthening pieces put in due to the skins panting. Panting is where the skins are moving with the airflow over them, and it will start to pull rivets, it will crack skins, and it will actually damage the structure inside. So we've found a few instances of that where there was a modification later on in the production line which actually put a reinforcing stringer in, but the earlier one hasn't had it done. A few other things we found: surface corrosion. So in the survey, we looked over the whole aircraft and removed all of the surface corrosion on the aircraft. This is actually a photo of the starboard flap, so the flap underneath the wing just behind the engine nacelle. And you can see here there's quite extensive surface corrosion which has been removed and treated, but it will have compromised the strength of that sheet material. It is too deep for us to use that sheet anymore, so that sheet skin will have to be replaced. All you see here is damage from how the spar works is it's got a big ram which moves an arm, which then moves smaller arms which are attached to the flap itself. So when the ram comes out, the arms push the flap down or pull it up. And if one of those arms snaps, it punches a hole through the flap. So if we want to be a bit Hollywood, we're going to say it's flak damage, but what it actually is just the flap arm which punched a hole through the skin. We didn't find it until we actually took the aircraft apart because it's hidden behind the engine DA, so the DA from the number 3 engine. DA is the cone that sits behind the engine and comes up and meets the wing. It's called DA because it looks like a duck's arse. What we find as well is problems with steel. There is a few sections of steel on the aircraft. This here is the ring that retains the tail turret on an X611. So that was found to be corroded when we took the turret out. So the front turret and the rear turret ring are both corroded and will need replacing. They're fine, they're holding the turret without a problem, but you cannot justify refitting that to an airworthy aircraft. So it'll have to be a new thing that's stamped out. One of the problems that's leading to the most work and the most bits to have to be replaced is something called dissimilar corrosion. Dissimilar corrosion is what happens between two materials when they react with each other, and if there isn't a good enough barrier, so a sufficient barrier between the two materials, they actually start attacking each other and eat through each other. So this here is an aluminium extrusion which is on the port fin. So what's happened here is one of the modifications to strengthen the extrusion was to fit a short piece of steel, so a thin piece of steel within the extrusion to add some extra strength, and it stretches up the length of the extrusion, probably about a third of the way. And what's happened here is the steel has corroded, and it has in turn corroded the aluminium, and it's eaten away at the aluminium. So this extrusion is no longer satisfactory for airworthy, and it's currently being replaced. Yeah, to fly you need to replace that. And basically what the corrosion is doing is it's flaking away the surface material of the extrusion to such a degree that then it falls off. And of course, the more meat, the more material you lose, the weaker the structure is. We've also found here on the port rudder that a mid-modification, so the first modification to a string of modifications on this area, was to just clamp or screw a piece of steel over the top of where the hinge attaches to the rudder, which fixed the problem during wartime. Would have been fine. If this Lancaster had been shot down, you'd probably done a few hours on that modification and then it would have been scrapped. But because this aircraft has seen 70 years, there's been eventual corrosion between the two materials, and you see that's actually eaten through the post of the rudder. So that's one of the strongest parts of the rudder. So this obviously section is being replaced, or has been produced to be replaced, and we are now looking through the modifications on the rudder to bring it up to the latest mod state, which actually takes out this piece of steel and inserts steel pieces inside, so it's still steel for the strength. But the way that we can then protect the aircraft is by putting barrier wood on board the aircraft. So this is the port fin leading edge. These should all be one piece of wood, but they have over time parted ways, and they've started to destroy themselves and rot away. So this is why we decided we needed to do the tail fins first, because if we didn't, then they would start to fall apart. Basically, they'd pull themselves apart. So this is the skins on the fin, which are actually screwed through to the wood. And what's happened is over the years, with the canvas tape that is put over the top of this join, has rotted away. It's allowed moisture to get in. The moisture's got into the wood. The varnish on the wood has just destroyed itself over time. It's run away with itself, and it's allowed the moisture to get into the wood and basically rot it like if you'd left a piece of wood outside. Materials. One of the biggest problems we've got on materials is the fact that they don't still make the same materials as what they made during the wartime. So if we have a piece like the fin post I was talking about that needs reproducing, you can't get the same material spec as you did during wartime. So you then have to put a modification in to find a similar material that has the same properties or is stronger. So a lot of what we're actually going to is an American spec material, American spec aluminium. So there's a lot of actual cost goes into doing the modification to be allowed to use these materials. We couldn't just go and get a commercial piece of aluminium from B&Q and start making the aircraft out of it. It all has to come with a certificate of conformity, and it all has to be have its relevant stress calculations from a stress house to say, yes, this material is sufficiently strong or stronger than the original. And that all goes in the work pack, and that's why when the Lancaster is ready to fly, the work pack weighs the same as the Lancaster. Time's a big factor for us. And here's us running away from May 2019 when we have to have the aircraft running again for taxi runs. We have 6 months over the winter to do the work, 6 months of taxiing, 6 months to do the work, 6 months taxiing. So we have to fit all of our work in a 6-month period. And quite honestly, we're going to get to a stage when that's not possible. When we have to take wings off and do wing structure, I doubt very much that we're going to actually fit that work into a 6-month period. So it may well mean that we have to extend our restoration period, shorten the taxi run period, which of course reduces income, which means it's going to be much harder to afford to do the work to the aircraft, which brings us on to money. So the way this project is funded is purely by people like your good selves coming, visiting the centre, paying your admission fee, and that money goes towards the restoration of the Lancaster and the operating of the centre. So every cup of tea you buy, every cake you buy, every book you buy in the shop, all goes towards funding this restoration. We can't simply stop taxiing the aircraft, take her apart and restore her, because we don't have the funds coming in to do that work. And although during the winter period we have people like yourselves coming to this talk, people coming to the winter restoration tours that we do around the aircraft, people coming to see the work happen, it's a drop in the ocean in comparison to the amount of money that's spent each winter. Each winter we're spending at the moment, or sorry, the last 3 winters, we've spent in the region of £140,000 net on the aircraft. The whole budget or project expected cost for the Lancaster, because to a degree you can't have a budget when you're doing this, because there's so many things you're going to find as you go through that you just haven't factored for because you weren't expecting it. So the whole expected cost of this project is £3.5 million. We've currently spent in the region of £1 million. We don't get any grants from anywhere, we don't get any tax relief, so we pay full tax on the fuel that we purchase, we pay full business tax, we pay full business rates. So obviously the cost of this hangar is rated as if it's a storage hangar that we're renting out for people to store their goods in. So there's a huge amount of business rates on the museum, and there's nothing we can do about it really in that respect. We don't get any external funding, so it is all funded by the taxi rides and good people like yourself actually helping us along the way. The team, so we have a team currently of about 19 people that are working on this Lancaster. There's the accountable manager for the CAA registered company, that's myself, and I also organise the logistics of all the work taking place. We have a chief engineer, who's the chief engineer on the A823 company. He does about 3 days a week. We have 4 full-time engineers who work with us full-time throughout the year, so they're also working summer as well as winter. We have 3 contracted airframe riggers who help us for the 6 months over the winter period. So they're contractors. We tend to get the same contractors back, so they're familiar with the project. But they're contractors that will work for us for 6 months and then probably go and work for BA or Ryanair, and they'll be working on your civilian airliners that you fly on holiday on. We have a contracted electrician who's actually here today, and we have 9 volunteers as well. So those volunteers range from somebody helping booking the stores in, to somebody cleaning corrosion, somebody doing electrics with Taff, the electrician. So there's a wide range of jobs that the volunteers are doing, and they're just that extra bit of manpower. They kind of make the difference between whether you can afford to do the job or whether you can't, because they're doing the jobs that we can't justify paying the high-priced engineers to do, basically. So how's it funded? As I've said, Lancaster Taxi Rides, that produces the majority of the income that we need for actually doing the restoration. And I'll move on, I think it's the next slide, to actually what funds comes from those taxi rides. Of course, museum admission fees and the events that we hold, all that money comes in towards restoring the Lancaster. Any donations that we receive, so that we are fortunate that we have things like a Just Jane cheese and a Just Jane beer that help. They give a percentage of what they take from the sale of those products towards the Lancaster. We've just received £2,800 for a year's sale of the Just Jane cheese and £1,400 for a year's sale of the Just Jane beer. So every time you buy one, that little percentage all adds up, and it actually does add up to quite an amount to help with the project. We have something called the Rivet Club, which is a monthly donation, and that Rivet Club then gives you a weekly email during this period and a monthly email during the summer period. And that keeps you up to date with the work that's happening to the aircraft and all the restoration work. You get a lot of photos that you wouldn't normally see, and you also get access to some webcams so you can log in from home and see what's happening with the restoration of the aircraft. That Rivet Club donation is anything from £2 up to £50 if you wanted each month. And so far, this year it's looking like that will have raised about £45,000. So that's a good chunk towards the restoration of the aircraft. Of course, I would say, everybody please join the Rivet Club and help to fund the restoration, but I'm not here on a sales pitch. We also have our membership for the centre, the Just Jane Supporters Association. That's I think the silver membership is £30, the gold membership is £65, and that gets you admission to the centre any day you want to come. The silver membership gets you half-price admission to the air show, gold membership gets you free admission to the air show, so you can come as many times in a year as you want. Bearing in mind the admission fee is £8.50, you only have to come a few times before you've got your money back on your membership. You also get an annual magazine as well, which tells you all about what's been going on at the centre. And of course the cafe and the shop sales all go towards it as well. So, just to look at a year's operating of the Lancaster for doing taxi runs. So, I think this is 2017-18 taxi run year. So we taxied for a total time of 36.25 hours, and with the cost of the work with the aircraft, the operating of the aircraft, it works out at £7,500 an hour. That's net, so that's plus VAT. And so all these costs include the normal operating costs of the Lancaster, so everything that we have to be able to taxi her, plus the restoration work that we're doing to make her airworthy. So fuel, oil, compressed air, so all operating costs, the engineering staff costs, the insurance, £195,000 a year. So parts production with the specialist firms, so that's all towards the restoration of the aircraft. So the willing of the skins, the forming of new formers and ribs, £39,120. CAA costs, these are ramping up each year, and this year is going to be quite a lot more actually as we go through the writing of the exposition for the company and the meetings with the CAA to get the official stamp on the project. So the CAA costs for that year were £2,000. That's more likely going to be closer to 7 or 8, I would imagine, this next year. Rivets, AGS, so rivets, nuts, bolts, and metal, so purchasing skin aluminium to be formed, £9,000. Equipment hire, so that's anything from heaters through to scissor lifts to crane hire, so that's £3,840. Paint, cleaning and consumables, so that's anything from masking tape through to paint, through to polythene sheeting, and those rubber discs, for example, that we use for cleaning aluminium, that's £5,000. Then NDT and testing is about £8,000. So the NDT is non-destructive testing, so that's the X-raying of items, eddy current testing, so finding cracks, and just majority of the NDTing after this year will just about be finished. We'll have a good record of everything that needs to be NDT'd and therefore the work that needs to be done to it. Okay, so that kind of wraps up where we are with the restoration. So next year we're looking at the rear fuselage section of the aircraft being taken apart and restored to airworthy. So it'll have to be completely paint stripped inside as well, which is going to be a huge job. We're looking at using probably dry ice for that or soda blasting. We'll see which is the most effective. So looking forwards, you've seen what we're going to be doing each year, with that culminating in a 10 or 11 year project actually with a completely airworthy aircraft. What we don't know is, for one winter period, we think it will take 6 or 7 months to do a job. It might actually take 2 winter periods. So that all of a sudden adds an extra year onto the expected restoration plan. So I'm not going to say take this with a pinch of salt, but speak to me again in 3 years and see how we're doing. As I said, it'll take about 3.5 million we're expecting, other than the extra problems we might find. And yeah, so next time somebody asks me, when's it going to fly? What's it take to fly? If you can just leave your names and addresses, and I'll just refer them to you, and you can recite what you've heard today.